The oak tree didn't ask permission before it fell. On that humid Houston morning in 1984, 26-year-old Greg Abbott was just another young Texan jogging through River Oaks, his mind focused on law school finals and dreams of public service. The massive tree, weakened by recent storms, chose that precise moment to surrender to gravity, crushing Abbott's spine and, in that single devastating instant, rewriting not just his personal story, but the future of Texas itself. "Why me, Lord?" The question echoed through the sterile halls of Herman Hospital as Abbott lay motionless, his promising future seemingly shattered like his vertebrae. His mother, Doris, clutched her worn Bible in the waiting room, her lips moving in silent prayer. She'd raised her son to believe that God's plan wasn't always comprehensible, but it was always purposeful. The doctors spoke in clinical terms about paralysis and limitations, but something else was happening in that hospital room, something the medical textbooks couldn't measure. Greg Abbott was discovering that sometimes God breaks us down to build us back stronger. The accident that should have ended his political dreams was actually forging the iron will that would one day make him the most formidable conservative governor in America. As Abbott learned to navigate his new reality from a wheelchair, he made a decision that would echo through the corridors of power for decades to come. He would not be defined by what happened to him, but by what he chose to do next. And what he chose to do would help transform Texas into the beating heart of Christian conservatism in America. The courthouse steps of Austin were slick with morning dew when Greg Abbott took his oath as Attorney General in 2003. But this wasn't just another political ceremony. This was a declaration of war against federal overreach. And Abbott was about to become Texas's chief legal gunslinger. With his right hand raised and his left firmly gripping his wheelchair, Abbott spoke words that would define his mission. "So help me God." Those weren't just ceremonial words, they were a battle cry. Within months, Abbott's office became ground zero for the most aggressive defense of religious liberty in the nation. When the federal government tried to remove "under God" from the Pledge of Allegiance, Abbott sued. When they attempted to strip nativity scenes from public squares, Abbott fought back. When they challenged prayer in schools, Abbott stood firm as the Alamo. Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below. And leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. Greg doesn't just practice law, observed his longtime friend and Baptist deacon, Mike Morrison. He wages spiritual warfare through legal briefs. The transformation was remarkable. The young man who once questioned God's plan in that hospital bed had become his most fierce legal advocate. Abbott understood something his critics never grasped. Texas wasn't just fighting for states' rights, they were fighting for the soul of America. And in that fight, compromise wasn't just political weakness, it was spiritual surrender. By the time Abbott filed his 44th lawsuit against the Obama administration, even his opponents had to admit this wheelchair-bound attorney general had become the most powerful defender of Christian values in the country. The tree that fell in 1984 hadn't destroyed Greg Abbott. It had forged him into exactly the weapon Texas needed. The pink granite dome of the Texas Capitol cast long shadows across the courtyard as Greg Abbott prepared for his gubernatorial inauguration in January 2015. But the ceremony carried weight beyond politics. It was a sacred covenant being forged between a man of faith and the most Christian state in America. As Abbott's wife, Cecilia, held the family Bible, her husband placed his hand on the worn leather cover and made a promise that would reshape the nation's moral landscape. Before Almighty God and the great state of Texas, Abbott declared, his voice carrying across the crowd of 10,000 faithful conservatives, "I pledge to defend our values, protect our freedoms, and ensure that Texas remains a beacon of Christian hope in an increasingly dark world." The crowd erupted, but Abbott wasn't playing to the gallery. He was making a divine contract. Within his first 100 days, Abbott proved his covenant wasn't campaign rhetoric. He signed the Pastor Protection Act, ensuring no minister could be forced to perform ceremonies against their conscience. He defunded Planned Parenthood, redirecting millions to pregnancy centers run by Christian organizations. He signed legislation protecting religious expression in schools, ensuring that young Texans could pray openly without fear. What we're witnessing, proclaimed Dr. Robert Jeffress from his Dallas pulpit, isn't just good governance, it's biblical leadership in action. But Abbott's most defining moment came during a late-night strategy session in the governor's mansion. Facing federal pressure to accept controversial social policies, Abbott made a decision that would echo from Austin to Washington. Texas will not bend the knee to anyone but God Himself. The covenant had been sealed, and America was about to discover what happens when Christian conviction meets gubernatorial power. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. in the governor's mansion, shattering the Austin silence like a gunshot. "Governor, we've got a situation." The voice belonged to Colonel Steve McCraw, director of the Texas Department of Public Safety. "Federal agents are mobilizing to enforce sanctuary policies. They're coming for our churches." Abbott's eyes opened in the darkness, his mind instantly sharp. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the moment when Texas would have to choose between federal compliance and divine calling. Rolling his wheelchair to the window, overlooking the Capitol grounds, Abbott gazed at the cross atop the nearby cathedral, its silhouette stark against the pre-dawn sky. "Not on my watch," he whispered, then louder, "not in my Texas." By sunrise, Abbott had activated what would become known as Operation Sanctuary Shield. Texas Rangers were deployed to protect churches, providing aid to vulnerable families. The governor's mansion became a war room where constitutional lawyers worked alongside Baptist ministers, Catholic priests, and Pentecostal pastors, an unprecedented coalition united by one man's unwavering faith. The federal confrontation came at First Baptist Church of Del Rio, where Pastor Miguel Hernandez had been sheltering families for weeks. As federal vehicles surrounded the church, Abbott's wheelchair rolled up the sanctuary steps, flanked by Texas Rangers and constitutional attorneys. "This is holy ground," Abbott declared to the assembled federal agents, his voice carrying the authority of both his office and his faith. "And I am bound by a higher law than Washington's bureaucracy." The standoff lasted 16 hours. Television cameras captured the image that would define Abbott's legacy: a governor in a wheelchair, facing down federal power, with the cross of Christ literally at his back. When the federal agents finally withdrew, church bells rang across Texas, not just in celebration, but in recognition. They had witnessed something unprecedented: a governor who put God's law above man's law and won. Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas coast like the wrath of God, wind speeds of 130 miles per hour. Rainfall measured in feet, not inches, and storm surge that swallowed entire communities. But in the governor's emergency operations center, Greg Abbott saw something the meteorologists couldn't measure: an opportunity for divine intervention. As reports poured in of catastrophic flooding across Houston, Beaumont, and Corpus Christi, Abbott made a decision that would transform disaster response forever. "Get me every pastor, every church leader, every Christian organization in the affected areas," Abbott commanded his staff. "We're not just coordinating with FEMA, we're mobilizing the body of Christ." What happened next defied every federal disaster manual. While government agencies struggled with red tape and bureaucracy, Abbott's faith-based response network moved like a modern-day miracle. Mega churches became refugee centers. Baptist disaster relief teams deployed faster than National Guard units. Catholic charities and Protestant food banks created supply chains that shamed federal logistics. The most powerful moment came when Abbott, accompanied by Franklin Graham and Pastor Joel Osteen, visited the George R. Brown Convention Center, where thousands of evacuees sought shelter. As Abbott's wheelchair moved through the crowd, something extraordinary happened: spontaneous prayer. Circles formed around him. "Governor," called out Maria Gonzalez, a grandmother who'd lost everything in Dickinson, "would you pray with us?" Abbott stopped his wheelchair, reached out his hands, and in that moment, the boundary between church and state dissolved. Surrounded by hurricane victims of every race and denomination, the governor of Texas led a prayer that was broadcast live across the nation. Not a political prayer, but a desperate, honest plea for divine mercy and healing. "Lord," Abbott prayed, his voice breaking. "We know you don't cause these storms, but you can use them. Use this tragedy to show America what happens when your people unite in love and service." The prayer was answered. Harvey's destruction was historic, but so was the response. Texas churches and Christian organizations outperformed federal agencies in every metric that mattered: speed, efficiency, and compassion. The hurricane that should have broken Texas instead revealed its true power, a faith so deep it could move mountains, or at least move a nation toward God. February 2021 brought a cold snap that would have made the Donner Party weep. Temperatures plummeted to -19 in Dallas, to in Houston, and across Texas. The power grid began failing like a house of cards. Pipes burst, electricity vanished, and Texans found themselves trapped in their own homes. Freezing in the dark, the crisis would test not just Texas infrastructure, but Greg Abbott's faith-based leadership philosophy. "Governor, we're looking at complete grid failure," reported the chief of ERCOT, Texas's power operator. "We've got senior citizens freezing to death, hospitals running on backup power, and no clear timeline for restoration." Abbott sat in his darkened office. Even the governor's mansion had lost power and faced the darkest moment of his political career. Critics would later call it his Katrina moment, but Abbott saw it differently. This wasn't just a failure of infrastructure. It was a test of faith. The decision that defined Abbott's response came at 3 a.m. on February 16th. Instead of calling federal agencies first, Abbott reached out to his network of faith leaders across the state. "Pastors," he said in a conference call with over 100 church leaders, "Texas needs you now more than ever." What followed was the largest faith-based disaster response in American history. Mega churches with generators became warming centers. Baptist churches with functioning kitchens fed thousands. Catholic parishes opened their doors to families whose homes had become uninhabitable. Pentecostal congregations organized wellness checks on elderly members. The most iconic moment came when Pastor Ed Young of Fellowship Church in Grapevine live-streamed his church's response efforts. Viewers worldwide watched as Abbott, bundled in winter gear, served hot meals to families in the church fellowship hall. His wheelchair navigating between tables where Texans of every background shared warmth and hope. "Some folks are asking why churches are doing FEMA's job," Young said during the broadcast. But Governor Abbott understands something Washington doesn't. In Texas, the church isn't just a building, it's the heart of every community. The winter storm lasted 6 days. When it ended, 246 Texans had died. The power grid was in ruins, and critics lined up to blame Abbott for the failures. But something else had happened during those dark, frozen nights. Texas had proven that faith-based community response could succeed where government agencies failed. The churches that stayed warm, fed the hungry, and sheltered the homeless didn't just save lives, they saved Abbott's political career and reinforced his conviction that God's people, properly mobilized, could accomplish miracles. As the ice melted and power returned, Abbott stood before the Texas legislature and delivered words that would echo through conservative circles nationwide. "We learned that our greatest infrastructure isn't made of steel and concrete, it's made of faith and community. And that infrastructure will never fail us." The leaked Supreme Court draft hit Austin like a lightning bolt on a clear day. Roe v. Wade was about to fall, and Texas under Greg Abbott's leadership was positioned to become ground zero for the most consequential moral battle in American history. But this wasn't just about politics for Abbott. It was about a promise he'd made to God decades earlier, kneeling beside his hospital bed after the accident that changed his life. "Every life has purpose," he'd whispered then, his own future uncertain. Now, as governor, he had the power to protect the most vulnerable lives of all. The war room in the governor's mansion buzzed with activity as Abbott's team prepared for what they knew would be the fight of their lives. Constitutional lawyers, pro-life activists, and faith leaders worked side by side, crafting legislation that would make Texas the most pro-life state in America. But Abbott's most trusted advisor wasn't in that room. It was the voice of his conscience, shaped by years of Sunday sermons and private prayer. Governor asked his chief of staff, "The media's going to paint this as extremist. Are you sure?" "We want to push the heartbeat bill this hard?" Abbott's response was swift and unwavering. When did protecting innocent life become extreme? When did following God's commandments become radical? The signing ceremony for Senate Bill 8, the Texas Heartbeat Act, took place not in the Capitol Rotunda, but in a small Christian pregnancy center in Plano, surrounded by women who had chosen life, adoption counselors, and pastors who had spent decades ministering to families in crisis. Abbott put pen to paper on the most restrictive abortion law in the nation today. Abbott declared, his voice thick with emotion, "Texas chooses life, not because it's politically expedient, but because it's morally imperative." The backlash was immediate and vicious. Corporate boycotts, celebrity condemnation, federal lawsuits, all designed to break Abbott's resolve. But something unexpected happened. Instead of backing down, Abbott doubled down. He called a special legislative session to pass even stronger protections for the unborn. The defining moment came during a heated confrontation with abortion rights protesters outside the Capitol. As angry voices shouted accusations and threats, Abbott's wheelchair rolled slowly toward the crowd. The security detail tensed, but Abbott raised his hand for calm. "I understand your passion," he said, his voice carrying across the hostile crowd. "But I want you to understand mine. Every child deserves the chance I almost didn't get. Every life has the potential to change the world, and I will never apologize for defending that truth." The silence that followed was deafening. In that moment, even his harshest critics saw something they couldn't dismiss. A man whose convictions weren't political calculations, but moral imperatives forged in personal crucible. The call came at dawn. Another caravan was heading toward Texas, and this one was different. Intelligence reports suggested over 15,000 migrants were en route to the Rio Grande Valley, part of the largest surge in American history. But for Greg Abbott, this wasn't just an immigration crisis, it was a test of sovereignty, security, and the Christian duty to protect both the vulnerable and the law-abiding. Standing on the banks of the Rio Grande in McAllen, Abbott gazed across the muddy waters toward Mexico and felt the weight of history. This river had seen Spanish conquistadors, Texas Rangers, and countless families seeking better lives. Now, it would witness the most ambitious state-led border security operation in modern American history. Operation Lone Star isn't just about securing our border, Abbott announced to the assembled Texas National Guard troops and state troopers. It's about upholding the rule of law that makes freedom possible. It's about protecting both those who come here legally and those who already call Texas home. But Abbott's approach was uniquely Texan, tough on illegal entry, but compassionate toward legitimate asylum seekers. He expanded state-funded programs for legal immigrants, while simultaneously deploying razor wire and National Guard units to prevent illegal crossings. It was a balance that reflected his deep Christian conviction that love and law must work together. The most controversial moment came when Abbott authorized the busing of migrants to sanctuary cities like New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. Critics called it a political stunt, but Abbott saw it as biblical justice, forcing those who demanded open borders to share the burden. They expected Texas to bear alone. "If you want to be a sanctuary city," Abbott declared at a press conference, "then act like one. Don't just preach compassion, practice it." The strategy worked. Within months, even Democratic mayors were acknowledging the crisis they'd previously denied. But Abbott's masterstroke came during a meeting with Catholic bishops along the border. Instead of defending his policies, he asked for their prayers and guidance. "Bishops," Abbott said, removing his cowboy hat in the small chapel of Sacred Heart Church in Roma, "I need wisdom. How do we show Christ's love while upholding Christ's justice? How do we welcome the stranger while protecting the citizen?" The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and changed everything. The bishops didn't endorse Abbott's every policy, but they recognized his genuine struggle to balance competing moral imperatives. Together, they developed what became known as the Border Covenant, a framework that prioritized legal immigration, supported legitimate asylum seekers, but firmly opposed human trafficking and cartel violence. By the end of 2023, Texas had achieved something unprecedented. Illegal crossings in Abbott-controlled sectors dropped by 70%, while legal immigration processing increased by 40%. The border was more secure, but also more humane. Abbott had proven that Christian governance wasn't about choosing between justice and mercy. It was about making them work together. The sun set over the Texas Capitol on January 15, 2025, painting the pink granite dome in shades of gold and crimson as Greg Abbott prepared for what many speculated might be his final State of the State address as governor. Rumors swirled about his political future. Some whispered about a Senate run, others about a spot on the national ticket. But Abbott's mind wasn't on Washington. It was on the transformation he'd witnessed and led over the past decade. Texas hadn't just become the most conservative state in America, it had become proof that Christian governance could work in the modern world. The joint session of the Texas legislature rose in applause as Abbott's wheelchair rolled to the podium. But he wasn't thinking about the politicians before him. He was thinking about the faces that had defined his journey, the hurricane victims who had prayed with him in Houston, the pastors who had opened their churches during the winter storm, the families who had chosen life because Texas chose to protect it. My fellow Texans, Abbott began, his voice carrying across the packed chamber. 10 years ago, some said that faith-based governance was impossible in modern America. They said you couldn't run a state on biblical principles without compromising either your faith or your effectiveness. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across Democrats and Republicans alike. They were wrong. What followed wasn't just a political speech, it was a testimony. Abbott recounted how Texas had led the nation in job creation while maintaining the strongest pro-life protections, how they had secured the border while increasing legal immigration, how they had weathered natural disasters through faith-based community networks that outperformed federal agencies. We proved that when you govern with conviction, when you lead with courage, when you trust in God's providence, you don't just win elections, you change lives. You don't just pass laws, you transform communities. You don't just serve a term, you serve a purpose. The most powerful moment came when Abbott called to the gallery the people who had shaped his journey. Maria Gonzalez, the grandmother who had asked him to pray during Hurricane Harvey, Pastor Miguel Hernandez, whose church had become a sanctuary during the immigration crisis, Dr. Sarah Williams, who had counseled countless women at the pregnancy center where he'd signed the Heartbeat Act. These are the people who taught me that Christian governance isn't about imposing our faith on others, Abbott said, his voice breaking with emotion. It's about living our faith so authentically that others want to know its source. As Abbott concluded his address, something unprecedented happened. The chamber erupted, not just in applause, but in a standing ovation that lasted 7 minutes. Democrats and Republicans, Christians and non-Christians, all recognizing that they had witnessed something rare in American politics. A leader who had governed exactly as he had promised, regardless of the political cost. But the real testament to Abbott's legacy wasn't in that chamber, it was across Texas and beyond. In churches that had learned to be more than Sunday gatherings, becoming community lifelines. In families that had been saved by pro-life policies. In communities that had been transformed by faith-based disaster response. In a border that was both secure and humane. As Abbott left the Capitol that evening, rolling his wheelchair down the same steps where he'd been sworn in a decade earlier, he thought about the oak tree that had fallen in 1984. That tree had seemed like a tragedy then, an obstacle to overcome. Now he understood it differently. God hadn't allowed that tree to fall despite his plans for Greg Abbott's life. He had allowed it to fall because of his plans. The young man who might have become just another politician had instead become something Texas needed more. A prophet of Christian governance, showing America that faith and freedom weren't enemies, but allies. The Lone Star still shone over Texas, but now it shone brighter, illuminated by the light of conviction, powered by the strength of community, and guided by the wisdom of a man who had learned that sometimes God's greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest struggles. Texas had become America's Christian vanguard, not through force or manipulation, but through the simple power of authentic faith lived out in public service. And Greg Abbott, the man who had questioned God's plan in a hospital bed 40 years earlier, had become the answer to his own prayer, proof that every life, no matter how broken, has the potential to change the world.